Hello and welcome. We will be analyzing both Brian Albert and Brian Higgins.
Mr. Albert, are you close friends with Brian Higgins?
I wouldn't describe it as close friends, no.
He's a fellow law enforcement officer, correct?
Yes,
Works for the ATF,
he does.
the the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, correct?
Yes.
How long have you known Mr. Higgins?
I think I first met Mr. Higgins about 15 years ago.
How did you meet him?
It was a professional something at work. We may have worked together. I think at the time he was a Cambridge arson squad member. And I think he came into the city of Boston to do something for work.
With respect to Brian Albert, how would you describe sort of your relationship around this time in January 2022?
He's a good friend. He's a co-worker. I had been working closely with his unit. I'd say he was a good friend.
Notice the contrast between Brian Albert's version of their friendship and Brian Higgins' version of their friendship. It's like they didn't get their story straight for this one. Brian Albert clearly said, I wouldn't consider him a close friend. But Brian Higgins considers Brian Albert a good friend.
I'm just not clear on what all the dates were.
I'll see if I can clarify.
Okay.
April 2022, state grand jury. June of 2023, a different grand jury.
Okay.
When you were asked at the June of 2023 grand jury, did you ever talk with Karen Reed at the waterfall that night? Your answer was, I did not. Correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. With the court's permission, could I play a small clip from Exhibit 53?
Okay.
Starting at timestamp 11:53 and 15 seconds. If we could just play this, and I would direct your attention, sir, to the upper right-hand corner.
Brian Higgins is in between Brian Albert and Karen Reed. Karen Reed is on the right, very close to Brian Higgins, and Brian Albert is on the left, to the left of Brian Higgins. And Brian Albert and Karen Reed are very clearly communicating with each other.
Pause it. Do you recognize the individuals in this clip?
Yes.
Do you recognize that person?
Yes, I believe that's me.
Do you recognize that person?
I do. I believe that's the defendant.
Ms. Reed,
Yes.
what does it appear you are doing as it relates to Ms. Reed in this clip?
It appears that I'm talking at the table. I don't know if it's specifically to her, but
Stop. Did you see the part of the clip starting at 11:53 and 15 seconds, going back about 30 seconds?
yes.
Who did it appear you were talking directly to, and who did it appear was answering directly to you?
I looked like I was speaking, but I can't say for sure that I was directly talking to the defendant.
Even though it looked
Bullshit, Brian Albert. Bullshit. Look at him trying to gaslight while there's video footage of it. Look at Brian Albert absolutely gaslighting Alan Jackson and everyone watching this trial. You didn't see what you just saw.
like you were looking right at her and leaning toward her as she was answering you.
I was definitely looking that way. I don't remember the conversation.
The reality
That wasn't the question, Brian Albert. Alan Jackson did not ask you, do you remember what you were talking about? Alan Jackson asked you if you were talking to Karen Reed because you told the grand jury that you never spoke to her. at the bar.
Yes, we can take that down. The reality is, Mr. Albert, you had many conversations with her throughout the night, like you would with anybody else you were socializing with, correct?
No.
It's not like you ignored her through that evening.
No, I think that just the positioning of me on the other side of the table, I didn't have really much contact.
There was only one person between you, and that was Mr. Higgins.
No, I don't think that was the setup for the whole night.
I didn't say the whole night.
Right.
I'm talking about right then.
Right, so,
That's an example.
right, what's your question? Rephrase your question, please.
Did you or did you not have conversations with Karen Reed that night?
I do not recall having conversations with Karen Reed that night at all, no.
And that's what you told the grand jury under oath, notwithstanding this video evidence to the contrary.
Yes, I don't think that video shows that.
I'm going to let that stand.
Brian Albert is a liar, and you can bring evidence to him. He's the kind of liar that even if you bring evidence to him, it doesn't matter. And I've dealt with people like this my whole life. My whole life. Plenty of people who do fucked up shit and then take zero accountability for it. They do fucked up shit, and even when you bring the receipts to them, when you bring the facts and you bring the proof, they still lie to you to your face. There are plenty of people out there, folks. Plenty of people out there. And if you're dealing with anyone like this, run the opposite way. Run anywhere, but do not go near them. Brian Albert, to me, is a dangerous man. This is a guy who can do horrendous things and lie to your face with a straight face. He's very comfortably lying. He's very comfortably gaslighting. And I am telling you folks, anyone watching this, if you are dealing with someone in your life who lies to you like this, who lies to you despite the evidence that you have, who lies to you despite the proof that you have, then you are dealing with a dangerous person, because they can essentially commit anything behind your back. They can do anything to you, and then they'll lie to you about it, and they'll drive you insane, thinking you don't know reality. You didn't see what you just saw. Brian Albert is not only a liar, Brian Albert is also a gaslighter, which makes him an abuser.
Next question, please.
You were interviewed by Michael Proctor on January 29th, the day after this incident, correct?
Yes.
And that was 6 days after you spent several hours, Karen Reed, at this event, correct? 6 days later.
Yes.
You were asked by Michael Proctor whether or not you knew or what your relationship was with Karen Reed, correct?
I don't recall if he asked me that.
Did you say to Michael Proctor, quote, that you quote, did not know Karen Reed, end quote?
I may have, yes.
But when you made that statement, you did not know that Ms. Reed had a photograph of you at the Hillside Bar, correct? You didn't know that photo existed, did you?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Sir, you were trying to distance yourself from Ms. Reed in your interview with Michael Proctor, weren't you?
Objection.
Were you?
No, I was not.
Mr. Albert, you were trying to distance yourself from knowing Ms. Reed in your grand jury testimony with, well, I'll use the date, in your April 2022 grand jury testimony, weren't you?
No.
You were further trying to distance yourself from Ms. Reed in your June 2023 grand jury testimony as well, correct?
No.
You thought that it was important to try to deny knowing John O'Keefe and Karen Reed during those interviews and or that testimony.
Objection.
Sustained.
Mr. Albert, you knew that if you admitted having a relationship with John O'Keefe and Karen Reed, you'd have a lot to answer for when Karen Reed's boyfriend ended up dead on your lawn 6 days later, correct?
Objection.
Sustained. You can ask the question differently.
You knew that there would be questions about your relationship with Karen Reed if it were known that you knew her before her boyfriend ended up dead on your lawn 6 days later, correct? There would be questions.
Objection.
You can ask it a different way. That's sustained.
So you lied under oath when you said, I've never met or seen her before, correct?
No, because that wasn't my whole statement.
The sentence, I've never met or seen her before, pretty unequivocal, isn't it?
That was not the context of my whole sentence.
But those are the words that came out of your mouth, right?
Initially, and then I remembered that I had met her once.
Let me just ask it this way.
Sure.
Is that sentence true or false? That you had never met or seen her before? True or false?
That portion of that sentence is false.
And I just want to say that Attorney Alan Jackson is excellent at disseminating bullshit. Attorney Alan Jackson is an experienced disseminator of bullshit. He has dealt with plenty of people, apparently, who know how to bullshit and know how to pull one over people. And he has, in my opinion, he has evolved. Attorney Alan Jackson has evolved to shut them down. The arguments he selects, the approach he has, the way in which he changes his questioning, dependent on how the witness is answering. It amazes me throughout this trial when witnesses were clearly testifying and contradicting themselves on the stand. Attorney Alan Jackson had this talent, this gift to call them on their bullshit and to really distill and filter out the bullshit and bring it down to what is actually going on. Just like here in this segment when Alan Jackson is talking to Brian Albert and trying to get out of Brian Albert, why did you say to the grand jury that you didn't know Karen Reed when you clearly did, or that you didn't speak with Karen Reed when you clearly did? Why are you trying to distance yourself from Karen Reed? And why is your sentence right here saying you've never spoken with her? You've never met her. Is it true or false? And that question, when Alan Jackson asked him that question, true or false, it was like checkmate. It's like you can't wiggle yourself out of this one, Brian Albert. True or false? And even though Attorney Alan Jackson, badass as he is, even though he distilled the bullshit down to a true or false question and made it very simple for Brian Albert to answer, Brian Albert still tried to wiggle himself out by saying that portion of it is false. Brian Albert, like I said, Brian Albert is a dangerous person because, again, you can show him evidence and then he will lie to your face and tell you that what you're seeing is not actually what you're seeing. And just like here at the very end, the very last example, when Attorney Alan Jackson asks Brian Albert, is this not your statement on the record? Is this not your statement on the record? And Brian Albert still, with his bullshit, Brian Albert still is like, that portion is false. And I don't know if you're following the Sarah Boone situation and all of her bullshit. She's very similar. She's similar to Brian Albert, which is telltale. Sarah Boone and Brian Albert are very similar in that it doesn't matter how reasonable you are with either of them. It doesn't matter how you question, how you word your question. They will find a way to wiggle themselves out and to remove all personal responsibility from themselves, even though all the evidence is pointing at them.
So if I could take you back, let me ask you this. As far as how would you describe your relationship with John O'Keefe?
I considered him a friend.
And how would you describe your relationship with Ms. Reed?
I considered her a friend as well.
Now, through the course of time that you knew them, did you have occasion to get their contact information and have communication with each of them through their phones?
I had John and I had exchanged telephone numbers.
And again, notice how so much Brian Albert was trying to distance himself from knowing Karen Reed. But Ryan Higgins is perfectly comfortable telling the court, telling the record, that he was friends with both John O'Keefe and Karen Reed for a year before John O'Keefe died.
And with reference to those communications, were they texts, were they phone calls, or varied?
Oh, they would be text.
And as far as the text communications that you had, you received this contact information, you texted, someone replied. How did you know that that was John O'Keefe that was replying to you?
Well, I had him saved in my phone, John O'Keefe. I don't know exactly where he gave me his phone number, but I knew it was him.
Now, on that evening, taking you back to the waterfall, January 28th into January 29th, do you know about what time it was that Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant came into the waterfall?
It would have been, I think, between like 11 and closing.
And do you recall sort of where you were situated in reference to the table when they came in?
So I think I was at the high top bar area, the high top in the bar area closest to the bar.
And when Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed came into the waterfall, what, if anything, did you observe? Where did they go when they first came in?
So when they first came in, I believe they may have initially went in, like, veered off in different directions. I recall that she opened her coat and took a drink out of it. I should say a glass.
And what, if any, observations did you make of the glass that...
So it is already clear that as soon as Karen Reed and John O'Keefe walked into the bar, into the Waterfall Bar and Grill, Brian Higgins was paying attention. He had his eyes on her. He knew what she was doing. Brian Higgins knew what Karen Reed was doing the moment she walked in.
Ms. Reed took out of her coat?
It was a tall glass. It looked like a clear liquid in there.
And at some point, did you come to find out where Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed had been prior to coming to the waterfall?
Sustained.
Are you familiar with another establishment in Canton called C.F. McCarthy's?
Yes.
Is that a place that you've been to before?
Yes.
Now, as far as the glass that you saw, with reference to the waterfall and or C.F. McCarthy's, what, if any, observations did you make of it?
Well, that it wasn't from the waterfall.
And what makes you say that?
Well, she walked in with it and took it out of her coat, but it wasn't consistent with the type of glasses that the waterfall had.
And I will leave the links to the original videos in the description below. But I wanted to make the point that another angle to this is that Karen Reed was prejudiced because she was not a member of law enforcement. The way in which Brian Albert and Brian Higgins conducted themselves on the stand could only have come from their experience in law enforcement. The way in which they were particular in describing things could have only came from their experience in law enforcement. When Brian Higgins describes the glass that Karen Reed had while at the Waterfall Bar and Grill, when he describes it as being inconsistent with the type of glasses that were at the Waterfall Bar and Grill. He is speaking like an investigator. He is speaking like a member of law enforcement. It wasn't consistent. The layperson, your friend, your family, if they are comparing things, it's highly unlikely that they're using the word consistent, right? Like, I was going to get that dress, but it wouldn't have been consistent with the pair of shoes. Like, regular people don't talk like that. People who talk like this, like Brian Higgins and Brian Albert and Michael Proctor, people who talk like this are used to writing reports. They are used to reporting. They are used to having to be official in how they communicate and to being very precise. And don't forget that Brian Albert did have the opportunity to prepare for this trial with Adam Lally, the prosecution. And don't forget that Brian Higgins was permitted to have his lawyer pull him off the stand while Brian Higgins was giving testimony. And that I have never seen in my life. Karen Read was prejudiced because she was not a member of law enforcement. And a majority of the people who were on the stand, on the prosecution side, the 68 witnesses who were on the prosecution side, a majority of them were either in law enforcement or involved with law enforcement in one way or another. Karen Read was not law enforcement. She was dating law enforcement, but she herself was not law enforcement. She wasn't married into it like the McCabe's and the Alberts. So we have people, members of law enforcement, first responders as well, on the stand, communicating very officially, appearing rather credible, because they are used to, again, reporting. They are used to documenting things. It's part of their jobs. When you are a first responder, a paramedic, it is part of your job to write things down and make reports and make sure they are accurate, make sure they are true, and make sure they are as specific as you can possibly make them. And the same is true for Brian Higgins and Brian Albert. Brian Albert being a police officer and Brian Higgins being an ATF agent. Brian Higgins especially has to be very precise, very specific, and very official. That's part of his job. And that's exactly how he's communicating while he's on the stand. Even referring to Karen Read, his friend, whom he considered a friend for a year, right? He's even referring to her as the defendant. Just like Jennifer McCabe referred to Karen Read as the defendant. Even though these people were friends with her, they were all friends with Karen Read. Or they pretended to be for some time. They all turned against her. They all pinned this on her so that Brian Albert, the homeowner, would suffer zero consequences. Brian Albert, the gaslighter, had everything working in his favor prior to trial and during trial. Brian Albert had people from multiple different levels of law enforcement at his side, while Karen Read had no one. They all dehumanized her, they all objectified her, and they all pretended to be her friend. And then they all abused their power as law enforcement, as members of law enforcement. After the fact, during trial, each and every one of them abused their power. Brian Higgins, in particular, having a high level as a federal agent, as he does, he should be investigated. Just like Michael Proctor was suspended without pay within the last 2 weeks, Brian Higgins should be suspended. None of us taxpayers should be paying for Brian Higgins to fuck around like he did. And he was clearly fucking around a lot, Brian Higgins. To me, Brian Higgins attempting to appear official and professional on the stand here, and appearing rather comfortable doing it too, if you notice. He's very comfortable on the stand, unlike Brian Albert. Brian Albert pretended he didn't know Karen Reed. Brian Albert pretended he didn't say what he said to the grand jury. Brian Albert pretended he didn't talk to Karen Reed, even though it was captured on camera. Brian Albert, for whatever reason, was far more uncomfortable on the stand than Brian Higgins. And it leads me to believe that Brian Albert has a bigger role in this than Brian Higgins. Or it's that they each have an equal role. Because remember, in murder, even if you didn't kill the person, if you were an accomplice, you are just as guilty under the eyes of the law. So both Brian Albert and Brian Higgins have good reason to keep their story straight and good reason to pretend that things didn't happen the way they did that night. But I have noticed that Brian Higgins appears to be far more comfortable, and he's not pretending that he was Karen Reed's friend. Unlike Brian Albert. Brian Albert absolutely distanced himself from Karen Reed. He distanced himself from John O'Keefe. To me, Brian Albert has a lot more to hide. And he has been hiding a lot. And he has gotten away with a lot. I really hope that Brian Albert and Brian Higgins are investigated. Brian Albert, as the homeowner, should have been investigated. And he never was. And Brian Higgins, as an ATF agent, should have also been investigated. He should have been held to a higher standard as a federal agent. But he never was. It's like Michael Proctor was low-hanging fruit, right? It's like, let's give the masses something out of this, because there was clearly so much corruption and this was clearly all a hot mess. Let's give the masses something to chew on for a while they're pissed off. Let's just say we suspended Michael Proctor without pay. And then everyone cheers. Yay, cheers, woo, right? But what the fuck about Brian Albert, the fucking homeowner? Or Brian Higgins, the federal agent who should have known better? What about those fools? When are they going to be suspended? When are they going to be investigated? Bros before hoes, it seems like, with Brian Albert and Brian Higgins, right? Karen Reed was a nobody. John O'Keefe deserved more than this bullshit. And so too does Karen Reed. Thank you for watching.